The Nevada desert stretched endlessly in every direction, a sea of sand and sagebrush, broken only by the occasional Joshua tree reaching toward the merciless sky like the arms of penitent sinners. The sun hung low on the horizon, painting the landscape in shades of gold and crimson that would have been beautiful if not for the bone-dry heat that seemed to leach the life from everything it touched. This was a land where only the hardiest creatures survived, where water was more precious than silver, and where a man's reputation was often the only thing standing between him and a shallow grave. Jake Morrison had been riding through this wasteland for 3 days, following a trail that existed more in legend than reality. His steel-gray stallion, Thunder, moved with the steady gait of a horse accustomed to long journeys across unforgiving terrain. The animal's coat was darkened with sweat, and foam flecked its muzzle. But Thunder was as tough as his rider and showed no signs of giving up. Morrison had chosen this horse carefully 5 years ago from a ranch in Colorado, recognizing in the stallion's eyes the same stubborn determination that had kept him alive through 15 years of bounty hunting. Morrison himself was a man carved from the same harsh stone as the desert around him. At 38 years old, his face bore the lines and scars that came from a life lived on the edge of violence. A thin scar ran from his left temple to his jaw, a souvenir from a knife fight in Tombstone. Another marked his right hand where a desperate outlaw had tried to bite his way to freedom. His eyes were the pale blue of winter sky, and they missed nothing as they constantly scanned the horizon for signs of danger or opportunity. The bounty hunter's clothing was practical rather than fashionable. His hat was a worn Stetson that had seen better decades, its brim shaped by countless hours under the desert sun. His shirt was faded blue cotton, reinforced at the elbows and shoulders with leather patches. His pants were sturdy canvas, tucked into boots that had walked through blood and dust across half the American frontier. Around his waist hung a gun belt of hand-tooled leather, and nestled in its holster was a Colt Peacemaker that had never failed him when the chips were down. Morrison had been tracking Dutch McKinnon for 6 weeks, following a trail that had led him from the gambling halls of San Francisco to the mining camps of the Sierra Nevada, and finally to this godforsaken stretch of nothing that most maps didn't even bother to name. McKinnon was worth $5,000 dead or alive, and Morrison had never failed to collect on a bounty once he set his mind to it. The outlaw was wanted for a string of crimes that read like a catalog of frontier evil: bank robbery, murder, rape, and cattle rustling. But what made McKinnon particularly dangerous was his intelligence. Unlike most of the men Morrison hunted, McKinnon was educated and cunning, able to stay one step ahead of the law by anticipating their moves and exploiting their weaknesses. The trail had grown cold 3 days ago in a settlement called Bitter Creek, where the locals claimed McKinnon had purchased supplies and asked directions to something called Goldenvale. The name had caused an immediate hush to fall over the saloon, and Morrison had noticed several men making the sign of the cross. When pressed for information, The bartender had reluctantly explained that Goldenvale was a ghost town about 50 miles northeast, a place where decent folks didn't go, and smart folks didn't even talk about. According to the bartender's whispered account, Goldenvale had been a thriving mining community 20 years ago, home to nearly 300 people who worked the gold claims in the surrounding hills. The town had everything a frontier community needed: a general store, a saloon, a church, a school, and even a small hotel for travelers passing through. Then one day, in the autumn of 1874, every single resident had vanished without a trace, not fled, not been massacred by Indians, not died of plague or famine. Simply vanished, as if they had all decided simultaneously to walk into the desert and disappear. The first search party had found the town intact, but empty. Meals sat half-eaten on tables. Horses stood in corrals waiting for owners who would never return. The bank vault was full of money, the general store was fully stocked, and personal belongings lay scattered throughout homes as if their owners had simply stepped outside for a moment and forgotten to return. Over the years, various expeditions had been organized to investigate the mystery, but none had ever returned with satisfactory answers. Some claimed to have found evidence of supernatural activity. Others insisted that the townspeople had been victims of some unknown catastrophe. But all agreed on one thing: Goldenvale was a place best left alone. Morrison had listened to these tales with the skepticism of a man who had seen too much of human nature to believe in ghost stories. In his experience, mysterious disappearances usually had very mundane explanations. Indian raids, disease, or simple economics driving people to seek better opportunities elsewhere. The supernatural elements were just embellishments added by people who preferred exciting lies to boring truths. But McKinnon's decision to head toward Goldenvale suggested that the outlaw saw it as the perfect hiding place, a location so feared that even the most dedicated lawman would hesitate to follow. Now, as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Morrison caught his first glimpse of what had once been Goldenvale. The town appeared suddenly, rising from the desert floor like a mirage made solid. From a distance, it looked almost normal, just another frontier settlement that time and economics had left behind. But as Morrison drew closer, details began to emerge that made his experienced instincts prickle with unease. The buildings were too intact for a town that had been abandoned for 20 years. Desert storms should have torn away loose boards. Flash floods should have undermined foundations, and scavengers should have stripped away anything of value. Yet Goldenvale stood as if its residents had left yesterday rather than 2 decades ago. The paint on the signs was faded but still readable. The windows were dusty but unbroken. Even the wooden sidewalks appeared solid and safe to walk on. Thunder began to show signs of nervousness as they approached the town's outskirts. The stallion's ears swiveled constantly, and Morrison could feel the tension in the animal's muscles. Horses had instincts about places and people that humans often missed, and Thunder's reaction was causing Morrison to reassess his casual dismissal of the supernatural theories Surrounding Goldenvale, the town was laid out in the typical pattern of a mining community, with a main street running roughly east to west, and smaller streets branching off to accommodate residential areas and industrial facilities. The main street was wide enough for two freight wagons to pass comfortably, a necessity in a town that depended on the constant flow of supplies and ore. On either side, false-fronted buildings created the illusion of a more substantial community than the rough mining camp that Goldenvale had probably started as. Morrison dismounted at what appeared to be the town's main hitching rail, a long bar of weathered wood that could have accommodated dozens of horses. Thunder immediately began pawing at the ground and rolling his eyes, behavior that Morrison had never seen from the normally steady animal. The bounty hunter took a moment to calm his mount before tying the reins, making sure the knots were secure enough to hold if Thunder decided to bolt. The silence that greeted Morrison as he stepped onto the wooden sidewalk was unlike anything he had experienced in his travels across the West. It wasn't just the absence of human voices or the sounds of daily activity. It was a complete and total quiet that seemed to muffle even the normal sounds of the desert. No birds sang, no insects buzzed, and even the wind seemed reluctant to disturb the unnatural stillness that hung over Goldenvale like a burial shroud. Morrison's first stop was the saloon, a two-story building with the name The Lucky Strike painted in faded red letters across its front. Bat-wing doors hung slightly open, moving gently back and forth with each breath of desert air. The bounty hunter pushed through the doors, his hand instinctively resting on the butt of his Colt as he surveyed the interior. The saloon was a monument to interrupted life. Tables were set for card games that would never be finished. Glasses sat on the bar, some still containing the dried residue of whiskey that had evaporated decades ago. A deck of cards lay scattered across one table as if dropped in the middle of a hand. Behind the bar, bottles of liquor stood in neat rows, their contents long since turned to vinegar or evaporated entirely. The mirror behind the bar was cracked in a spiderweb pattern, but it still reflected Morrison's image in fragmented pieces that made him look like a man broken into a dozen parts. What struck Morrison as most unsettling was the personal nature of the abandonment. A woman's shawl hung over the back of a chair. A man's pipe lay on the bar with a small pile of tobacco beside it. In one corner, a child's wooden horse sat abandoned, as if its young owner had been called away in the middle of play and had never returned to claim it. Morrison moved systematically through the saloon, checking every room and examining every detail for clues about what might have happened to the townspeople or signs that McKinnon had been here recently. In the back room, he found the saloon keeper's office, its desk still covered with papers and ledgers. A quick examination showed that the books had been kept meticulously right up until October 15th, 1874, and then simply stopped. There were no signs of distress in the handwriting, no indication that anything unusual had been happening. The entries were routine: orders for supplies, payments to employees, records of debts owed and collected, The second floor of the saloon contained rooms that had been rented to travelers and permanent boarders. Morrison climbed the narrow staircase, each step creaking ominously under his weight. The hallway was lined with doors, each bearing a number painted in neat black numerals. The bounty hunter opened each door systematically, revealing rooms that told stories of interrupted lives. Room 3 contained the belongings of what appeared to have been a traveling salesman. Sample cases sat open on the bed, displaying bolts of cloth, patent medicines, and small mechanical devices. A letter lay half-written on the room's small desk, its ink faded but still legible. My dearest Martha, I hope to conclude my business here within the week and return home to you and the children. The mining camp shows great promise, and I believe we shall do very well here. The people are friendly and eager for the civilized goods that I carry. I have taken a room at the local saloon and find it quite comfortable, though I admit I shall be glad to sleep in my own bed again. Give my love to little Sarah, and tell Thomas that his father thinks of him often. Your devoted husband, William. The letter was dated October 14th, 1874, just one day before the final entry in the saloon keeper's ledger. Morrison found himself wondering what had happened to William the traveling salesman and his family back home, who had waited for a husband and father who would never return. Room 7 told the story of a different kind of resident. The room was spartanly furnished, containing only the basics necessary for survival. A gun belt hung from a peg on the wall, but the holster was empty. Clothes were folded neatly in a trunk, and a small collection of books sat on the nightstand. A Bible, a volume of Shakespeare's plays, and a technical manual on mining techniques. This had been the room of a man who lived by violence, but aspired to something better. Perhaps one of the guards hired to protect the town's mining operations, or a reformed outlaw trying to build a new life in a place where his past wouldn't follow him. Morrison spent nearly an hour exploring the saloon, but found no sign that McKinnon had been there recently. The dust on every surface was uniform and undisturbed, suggesting that no one had entered the building in months or possibly years. Yet the bounty hunter couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that unseen eyes were tracking his every movement through the abandoned rooms. The general store was Morrison's next destination, a large building that had obviously been the commercial heart of Goldenvale. The sign above the door read, Goldenvale Mercantile, Proprietor Josiah Cunningham, established 1872. The front windows displayed merchandise that had been carefully arranged to attract customers who would never come. Bolts of cloth, tools, household items, and luxury goods that represented the aspirations of a community that believed in its own future. Inside, the store was a revelation of frontier commerce. The shelves were still fully stocked with goods that represented the lifeline between civilization and the wilderness. Canned foods sat in neat rows, their labels faded but still readable. Peaches from California, condensed milk from back east, beans from Texas. Barrels contained flour, sugar, and salt. though their contents had long since been claimed by insects and vermin. Hardware hung from hooks and filled bins, nails, hammers, saws, rope, and all the tools necessary to build and maintain a community in the middle of nowhere. Behind the main counter, Morrison found the store's account books, as meticulously kept as those in the saloon. Josiah Cunningham had been a careful businessman, recording every transaction down to the penny. The final entries showed a thriving business with regular customers and a healthy cash flow. There were no signs of economic distress, no indication that the town was facing the kind of financial difficulties that might cause mass migration. What puzzled Morrison was the amount of money still in the store's cash drawer. He counted nearly $200 in gold and silver coins, a fortune that no scavenger would have left behind. The presence of the money suggested either that no one had entered the store since the disappearance, or that something had prevented them from taking the obvious wealth that lay openly displayed. The dry goods section of the store told its own story of interrupted commerce. Half-filled orders sat on the counter as if Cunningham had been in the process of assembling them when something had called him away. A list in the proprietor's careful handwriting detailed items requested by various customers. Mrs. Henderson, 5 lbs flour, 2 lb sugar, 1 bolt blue calico. Mr. Thompson, box, Power 4 cartridges, 1 lb tobacco, writing paper. Sarah Mitchell, 2 yards ribbon, soap, ladies' magazine from Denver. Morrison could almost see the ghost of daily life in these mundane details. Mrs. Henderson baking bread for her family, Mr. Thompson maintaining his weapons and correspondence, young Sarah Mitchell trying to bring a touch of fashion to the harsh realities of frontier life. All of them had been real people with real lives, hopes, and dreams that had ended abruptly on that October day 20 years ago. The back room of the general store had served as both storage and living quarters for the Cunningham family. Morrison found evidence of a wife and at least 2 children. A woman's dresses hanging in a wardrobe, small clothes that could only have belonged to youngsters, and toys scattered about as if dropped in the middle of play. On the kitchen table sat the remains of what had once been a family meal, now reduced to organic stains on plates that insects had long since cleaned. A family Bible lay open on a side table, its pages turned to Psalms. Morrison read the verse that had been underlined in fading ink. "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me." He wondered if Josiah Cunningham had been seeking comfort from that passage in his final days, or if the Bible had simply fallen open to that page by chance. As Morrison continued his exploration of Goldenvale, he began to notice patterns that made him increasingly uneasy. Every building told the same story. Life interrupted suddenly and completely. The barber shop still had hair on the floor around the chair. The blacksmith's forge contained metal that had been heated and then abandoned, now rusted solid after 20 years of neglect. The schoolhouse held slates with half-finished lessons, children's work that would never be completed or graded. The hotel, a two-story structure called the Desert Rose Inn, provided perhaps the most poignant evidence of the town's sudden abandonment. The guest register showed arrivals right up until October 15th, with travelers signing in but never signing out. Room keys hung on hooks behind the front desk, waiting for guests who would never return to claim their belongings. In the dining room, place settings were arranged for a breakfast service that had never been served. Morrison climbed to the hotel's second floor, where he found rooms occupied by travelers who had been caught in whatever catastrophe had befallen Goldenvale. One room contained the luggage of a mining engineer, complete with surveying instruments and geological samples. Another held the possessions of a woman traveling alone, a rarity on the frontier that suggested she had been fleeing something or someone. Her diary, left open on the room's small desk, provided a glimpse into her final days. October 10th arrived in Goldenvale today after a difficult journey from Sacramento. The town seems prosperous and the people friendly, though I detect an undercurrent of tension that I cannot quite identify. I have taken a room at the hotel and plan to rest here for several days before continuing eastward. The proprietor, Mrs. Sullivan, has been most kind and has invited me to take meals with the family. October 12th. I have extended my stay as I find the town curiously fascinating. The mining operations appear to be quite successful, and there is talk of great discoveries in the hills surrounding the community. Several of the townspeople have mentioned strange lights seen in the desert at night, though they dismiss these as natural phenomena related to the mineral deposits in the area. October 14th. Something is happening here that I do not understand. Last night I was awakened by voices coming from the street below. When I looked out my window, I saw a procession of people walking toward the edge of town, carrying lanterns and moving with purpose. When I asked Mrs. Sullivan about it this morning, she seemed evasive and claimed to know nothing of any nighttime activities. I have decided to cut short my stay and depart tomorrow morning. The diary ended there, its final entry dated the day before the town's disappearance. Morrison found himself wondering what the unnamed woman had witnessed, and whether her decision to leave had come too late to save her from whatever fate had claimed the rest of Goldenvale's residents. The town's church stood at the far end of the main street, a simple wooden structure with a bell tower that reached toward the sky like a finger pointing toward heaven. The building was larger than might have been expected for a community of Goldenvale's size, suggesting that religion had played an important role in the lives of the townspeople. The sign beside the front door identified it as Goldenvale Community Church, Reverend Ezekiel Hartwell, pastor. All souls welcome. Morrison pushed open the heavy wooden doors and stepped into the church's interior. Sunbeams slanted through stained glass windows, creating patterns of colored light that danced across empty pews. The church could have seated perhaps 200 people, and Morrison imagined it filled with families gathering for Sunday services, children fidgeting in their best clothes, while their parents sang hymns and listened to Reverend Hartwell's sermons. The pulpit dominated the front of the church, a simple wooden structure that spoke to the practical nature of frontier religion. Behind it hung a large wooden cross, and on either side stood candelabras that had once held the candles used to light evening services. The altar was bare, except for a large leather-bound Bible that lay open to a passage from Revelations. The pages were yellowed with age, but the text was still clearly readable. And he opened the bottomless pit, and there arose a smoke out of the pit, as the smoke of a great furnace, and the sun and the air were darkened by reason of the smoke of the pit. Morrison found the choice of Scripture ominous, though he tried to tell himself that it was merely coincidence. Preachers often use dramatic passages from Revelations to emphasize points about salvation and damnation, and there was no reason to assume that this particular selection had any special significance. Yet the verse seemed to resonate with the mystery surrounding Goldenvale's fate, as if Reverend Hartwell had been trying to warn his congregation about something terrible that was about to befall them. The church's basement served as a community meeting room and storage area. Morrison descended the narrow stairs, his footsteps echoing in the confined space. The basement was filled with the usual church paraphernalia: folding chairs, tables, decorations for various holidays, and boxes of hymnals. But tucked away in one corner, Morrison found something that made his pulse quicken: a collection of mining maps and geological surveys that seemed to have no connection to religious activities. The maps were hand-drawn and extremely detailed, showing not only the locations of known gold deposits, but also a network of tunnels and chambers that extended far beneath Goldenvale. Someone had spent considerable time and effort mapping the underground geography of the area, marking specific locations with symbols that Morrison didn't recognize. One map in particular caught his attention. It showed a large chamber directly beneath the church, connected to the surface by a series of tunnels that appeared to lead to various buildings throughout the town. At the bottom of the box containing the maps, Morrison found a journal written in the same careful handwriting that had created the surveys. The cover was marked, "Private property of Reverend Ezekiel Hartwell. Confidential." The bounty hunter hesitated for a moment, weighing the ethics of reading another man's private thoughts against his need to understand what had happened to Goldenvale's residents. His curiosity and professional instincts won out, and he opened the journal to its first entry. June 15th, 1874. I have arrived in Goldenvale to take up my duties as pastor of the community church. The townspeople have welcomed me warmly, and I am impressed by their dedication to creating a civilized community in this harsh environment. However, I have already noticed certain irregularities that concern me. The mining operations seem to extend much deeper and in different directions than would be normal for gold extraction. When I have asked about this, I am told that the geological formations in this area are unique and require special techniques. June 20th. I have been approached by several of the leading citizens with a proposal that troubles me greatly. They claim to have discovered something in the mines that could make every resident of Goldenvale wealthy beyond imagination. However, They are reluctant to provide details, and their manner suggests that whatever they have found may not be entirely legal or moral. I have told them that, as a man of God, I cannot be party to any venture that might harm others or violate Christian principles. July 4th. The town celebrated Independence Day with great enthusiasm, but I noticed that the festivities were confined entirely to the daylight hours. As soon as darkness fell, the streets emptied completely, and I observed that many of the miners were gathering at the church for what appeared to be some kind of meeting. When I attempted to join them, I was politely but firmly told that my presence was not required. This troubles me, as I am supposed to be the spiritual leader of this community. July 10th. I have discovered that the basement of my own church contains maps and documents related to mining activities that extend far beyond what I had been told. The tunnels beneath Goldenvale form a complex network that reaches under every major building in town. More disturbing still, I have found references to something called the Deep Chamber and the Guardians Below. When I confronted the town leaders about these discoveries, they admitted that they have been conducting mining operations without my knowledge, but insisted that everything they are doing is for the betterment of the entire community. August 1st. I have learned the truth about Goldenvale's mining operations, and I fear for the souls of everyone in this community. The men are not simply extracting gold from the earth. They are following maps and instructions left by previous occupants of this land, people whose identity and ultimate fate remain mysterious. The tunnels lead to chambers that predate any European settlement, filled with symbols and artifacts that speak to practices I can only describe as unholy. August 15th, I have attempted to convince the townspeople to abandon whatever it is they have discovered beneath our community, but they will not listen. The promise of wealth has blinded them to the spiritual danger they face. I have seen the gold they have brought to the surface, and it is unlike any natural ore I have ever encountered. It glows with its own light and feels warm to the touch, even in the cool air of the underground chambers. There is something fundamentally wrong with this metal, something that speaks to forces beyond our understanding or control. September 1st. The situation has deteriorated beyond my ability to influence. The townspeople have divided into two factions: those who support the continued excavation of what they call the ancient treasure, and those who believe we should leave this place before something terrible happens. I have tried to mediate between the groups, but fear has replaced reason in the hearts of too many. I have begun to make plans to leave Goldenvale, though I am reluctant to abandon my flock in their hour of greatest need. September 15th. I can no longer ignore the evidence that supernatural forces are at work in Goldenvale. Strange lights appear in the desert at night, and I have heard voices speaking in languages that no living human could understand. Several townspeople have reported dreams and visions that seem to be calling them to the deep chambers beneath our feet. I have increased the frequency of prayer services and urged everyone to seek divine protection, but I fear it may already be too late. October the 1st. The barrier between our world and whatever lies beneath has grown thin. I have witnessed things that challenge everything I believed about the nature of reality and the power of faith to protect the righteous. The gold calls to people now, whispering promises of wealth and power that few can resist. I have seen respected members of our community transformed into something barely recognizable as human, their eyes glowing with the same unnatural light as the cursed metal they have found. October 10th. I have made the decision to seal the entrances to the underground chambers regardless of the consequences. The entity or entities that guard the ancient treasure have begun to demand payment for their generosity, and that payment appears to be measured in human souls. Several townspeople have already disappeared into the tunnels, and those who return are changed in ways that terrify me. I pray that God will forgive me for what I'm about to do, but I can see no other way to save what remains of this community. October 14th. It is too late. The guardians have completed their bargain, and the price has been set. Every soul in Goldenvale will be required to pay for the treasure that has been taken. I have tried to warn people, tried to convince them to flee, but the gold's influence has grown too strong. They cannot leave now, even if they wanted to. I have locked myself in the church and am writing these final words as a warning to anyone who might come after us. Do not seek the gold. Do not enter the deep chambers. Some treasures carry a price too terrible to pay. The journal ended there, with Reverend Hartwell's final entry dated just one day before the town's mysterious disappearance. Morrison closed the book and sat back on his heels, trying to process what he had just read. If the preacher's account was to be believed, the residents of Goldenvale had discovered something in the mines that was far more dangerous than simple gold ore. They had made a bargain with forces they didn't understand, and that bargain had ultimately cost them their lives and possibly their souls. Morrison was a practical man who had built his reputation on his ability to separate fact from fiction, but Reverend Hartwell's journal had the ring of truth to it. The preacher had been an educated man, someone who would have been skeptical of supernatural explanations unless confronted with evidence that couldn't be denied. His growing desperation and fear came through clearly in the journal entries, suggesting that he had witnessed things that challenged his faith and his understanding of the world. But reading about supernatural forces was one thing. Believing in them was another. Morrison had spent 15 years tracking dangerous men across the frontier, and he knew that human greed and stupidity could account for most of the mysteries that people attributed to ghosts and demons. It was possible that the townspeople of Goldenvale had discovered a rich vein of gold and then fallen victim to violence over its ownership. The supernatural elements could have been added later by people who preferred exciting mysteries to mundane explanations. Yet Morrison couldn't ignore the physical evidence that surrounded him. Goldenvale was too well preserved for a town that had been abandoned for 20 years. The presence of money and valuables suggested that whatever had happened to the residents, it hadn't been a simple case of robbery or economic collapse. And there was something about the atmosphere of the town that made Morrison's skin crawl, a sense of wrongness that he couldn't attribute to his imagination. Behind the altar of the church, Morrison discovered a trap door that had been carefully concealed beneath a heavy rug. The door was secured with a padlock that looked relatively new compared to the rest of the church's fixtures. Someone had made an effort to seal whatever lay beneath the church, and Morrison suspected that someone had been Reverend Hartwell in his final desperate attempt to contain the forces he had described in his journal. Morrison studied the lock carefully. It was a good quality mechanism, but not one that would challenge someone with his experience. He had learned lock-picking from a reformed burglar in Denver, a skill that had proven invaluable in his bounty-hunting career. Using tools from his saddlebags, Morrison worked at the lock until it clicked open. The sound seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet church, echoing off the walls like a gunshot. The trapdoor opened to reveal a set of stone steps that descended into darkness. Unlike the wooden construction of the church above, these steps appeared to be much older, carved from the living rock by hands that had worked this site long before Reverend Hartwell or any of Goldenvale's residents had arrived. The air that rose from the opening carried a smell that Morrison couldn't identify, something metallic and organic, like copper pennies mixed with decay. Morrison lit a torch from his supplies and began his descent into the underground chambers beneath Goldenvale. The steps were worn smooth by the passage of many feet over what could have been decades or centuries. As he moved deeper underground, the temperature dropped noticeably, providing relief from the desert heat, but also creating an environment that felt somehow unnatural. The walls of the tunnel were covered with symbols that had been carved deep into the rock, markings that resembled no written language Morrison had ever seen. The tunnel opened into a vast underground chamber that took Morrison's breath away. The space was enormous, easily large enough to hold the entire population of Goldenvale with room to spare. The ceiling arched high overhead, supported by natural rock formations that had been enhanced by human engineering. But what dominated the chamber was the gold. It wasn't the raw ore that Morrison had expected to find, but refined bars of pure gold stacked like cordwood in the center of the chamber. There had to be hundreds of bars, each one inscribed with the same strange symbols that covered the tunnel walls. The gold glowed with its own internal light, casting dancing shadows on the chamber walls and creating an atmosphere that was both beautiful and deeply unsettling. Morrison approached the treasure slowly, his hand resting on the butt of his Colt out of pure instinct. As he drew closer, he could feel heat radiating from the gold bars, warmth that seemed to penetrate his clothing and sink into his bones. The metal was definitely not natural. No gold he had ever seen produced its own light or generated heat without an external source. Scattered around the base of the gold pile were personal belongings that Morrison recognized from his exploration of the town above. A woman's shawl, a child's toy, a man's pocket watch, all arranged as if they were offerings placed before some kind of altar. Morrison realized with growing horror that these items had belonged to the missing townspeople, left behind when their owners had descended into this chamber and never returned to the surface. But the most disturbing discovery was yet to come. As Morrison circled the pile of gold, he began to notice bones scattered throughout the chamber, human bones, picked clean and weathered white, some still showing the remnants of clothing that identified them as belonging to the people of Goldenvale. The bones were arranged in no particular pattern, as if the bodies had simply collapsed where they stood and been left to decay where they fell. Morrison was examining a skull that showed no signs of violence when he heard the first whisper. The sound came from behind him, barely audible, but unmistakably human. A voice speaking words in a language he didn't recognize, but the tone was clear enough. Warning. The bounty hunter spun around, his Colt appearing in his hand with the fluid motion of years of practice. But he was alone in the chamber. The torchlight danced on empty walls and created shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. As Morrison stood frozen, listening for any sound that might indicate the presence of another living person, more voices joined the first. Whispers became murmurs. Murmurs became a chorus of the damned. Men's voices, women's voices, even children, all speaking in that same unknown language, all carrying the same warning tone. The voices seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing off the stone walls until the chamber filled with a symphony of desperate communication. That's when Morrison saw the first ghost. It appeared between him and the tunnel entrance, translucent but unmistakably human. A man in mining clothes, his face gaunt with starvation and his eyes hollow with an ancient sadness. The spirit's mouth moved as if speaking, but the words Morrison heard came from everywhere at once, like an echo in a cathedral. The ghost raised one spectral hand and pointed at the gold, then at Morrison, then made a slashing motion across its throat. The message was clear enough. Take the gold and die. More spirits began to materialize around the chamber, dozens of them, then hundreds, men, women, and children, all in the clothing of the 1870s, all bearing the same warning expression. Some showed obvious signs of violence, bullet wounds, rope burns around their necks, knife cuts that still bled ethereal blood. But others seemed to have died of starvation or disease, their ghostly forms emaciated and weak, their clothes hanging in tatters from bodies that were little more than animated skeletons. Morrison realized with growing horror that these had to be the missing residents of Goldenvale. They hadn't fled or been murdered by bandits or died of disease. They had died here in this chamber, victims of something connected to the cursed gold. And now they were trapped, bound to this place by forces that Morrison was only beginning to understand. As the bounty hunter watched, the spirits began to move closer, forming a circle around him and the treasure. Their whispers grew louder, more urgent, and Morrison began to make out individual words in English, mixed with the foreign language. "Leave," they said. "Run. Save yourself. The gold demands payment. Don't become like us." But Morrison was a man who had faced down killers, hostile Indians, and natural disasters in his 15-year career. He wasn't about to be scared off by ghosts, no matter how real they seemed. This gold could set him up for life, let him retire from bounty hunting and live like a king. All he had to do was figure out how to transport it without getting burned by whatever unnatural properties it possessed. As he pondered the logistics of moving the treasure, Morrison became aware that the spirits were no longer simply warning him. They were beginning to look desperate, even frantic, as if his mere presence in the chamber was causing them pain. One ghost, a woman in a torn dress, who appeared to have been beautiful in life, approached him with tears streaming down her spectral cheeks. She opened her mouth as if to scream, but no sound emerged except the continued chorus of whispers that filled the chamber. Morrison was beginning to understand that these spirits weren't malevolent entities trying to guard the treasure from the living. They were prisoners, trapped souls, who were being forced against their will to protect something they desperately wanted destroyed. Their warnings weren't threats. They were pleas for help from people who had made the same mistake Morrison was contemplating and had paid the ultimate price for their greed. But understanding the situation and accepting it were two different things. Morrison had spent his entire adult life pursuing money, whether in the form of bounty rewards or opportunities like this. The gold represented more wealth than he had ever dreamed of possessing, enough to buy a ranch in Colorado, enough to never have to strap on a gun again, enough to live like a gentleman instead of a hired killer chasing desperate men across the frontier. As Morrison wrestled with temptation and logic, a new voice entered the supernatural chorus, one that was stronger and more commanding than the others. It spoke in clear English, with an accent that Morrison couldn't quite place. European, but older somehow, as if it came from a time when language itself was different. You seek the treasure of Goldenvale, bounty hunter, but do you know the price that was paid for it? Morrison turned toward the voice and saw a figure that was more solid than the other spirits, though still translucent enough to reveal the chamber wall behind it. This ghost wore the clothes of a gentleman, a fine suit with a gold watch chain, polished boots, and a hat that spoke to wealth and education. His beard was neatly trimmed, and his eyes held an intelligence that the other spirits seemed to lack, as if death had not diminished his mental faculties as it had theirs. "I am Cornelius Blackwood," the spirit continued, stepping forward with the confidence of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "And I was the architect of Goldenvale's destruction, the man who brought this curse upon 300 innocent souls. 20 years ago, I led an expedition into the desert, following legends told by the local Apache tribes about a source of gold that predated their own arrival in this region. Gold that was said to be blessed by gods whose names were forgotten before the pyramids of Egypt were built. Morrison kept his gun trained on the spirit, though he knew bullets would be useless against something that was already dead. What happened to the town? Blackwood's ghostly form seemed to smile, but there was no humor in the expression, only infinite sadness and regret. We found the gold, just as the legends promised, but we also found the guardians that protected it, ancient spirits that had been bound to this place since before human civilization began. They offered us a bargain that seemed too good to refuse. Take all the gold we could carry, but in exchange, the entire town would serve as payment. 300 souls for 300 pounds of cursed metal. The bounty hunter could feel the other spirits pressing closer, their desperation growing more intense as Blackwood told his story. Morrison could see in their ghostly faces the moment of realization when they had understood the true cost of their greed, the horror of discovering that they had sold not just their own souls, but the souls of their families and neighbors. "You agreed to the bargain," Morrison stated, though it wasn't really a question. "I was a man consumed by avarice," Blackwood admitted, his translucent form seeming to solidify with shame. "I had spent my entire life pursuing wealth, convinced that money could solve every problem and fulfill every dream. The guardians offered me more riches than I had ever imagined, and I accepted their terms without fully understanding what I was agreeing to. I thought I could outwit ancient powers with modern thinking, that I could take their gold and find a way to avoid paying the price they demanded." Morrison could see where the story was leading, but he needed to hear it confirmed. But the spirits were cleverer than you anticipated. Far cleverer, Blackwood agreed. They cursed the gold so that anyone who touched it would be bound to this place, unable to leave, compelled to guard the treasure for eternity. I took one bar, planning to test its value and then return for more, but the moment the metal touched my skin, I became a prisoner of my own greed. One by one, the other townspeople came to investigate when I failed to return to the surface. One by one, they too became bound to the cursed treasure. The ghost's tale explained the scattered bones Morrison had noticed around the chamber, the personal belongings that suggested the townspeople had come here willingly, rather than being dragged by force. You all starved down here. Worse than that, Blackwood replied, his voice carrying the weight of 2 decades of guilt and regret. We became slaves to the guardians who had made the original bargain. We were forced to kill anyone who tried to take the treasure, to add their souls to our number. For 20 years, we have been prisoners in our own afterlife, guardians of wealth we can never enjoy, murderers against our will. Morrison was beginning to understand the full scope of the horror that had befallen Goldenvale. The townspeople hadn't simply died. They had been transformed into unwilling servants of the supernatural forces that protected the gold. They were conscious of their situation, aware of what they had become, but powerless to resist the compulsion that bound them to this underground chamber. "But you're warning me," Morrison observed. "You're trying to help me escape." Blackwood nodded, though the gesture seemed to cause him pain. "The curse binds our actions, but not our hearts. For 20 years, we have fought against our supernatural masters, trying to find a way to warn potential victims without directly violating our compulsions to protect the treasure. You are not the first person to find this place, Morrison. Over the years, prospectors, treasure hunters, and outlaws have discovered Goldenvale and the gold beneath it. All of them have joined our ranks, adding their souls to the collection of the damned." The bounty hunter looked around the chamber at the hundreds of spirits surrounding him, realizing that not all of them were original residents of Goldenvale. Some wore clothing from different time periods, and a few appeared to be Mexican or Indian rather than European American. These were the other victims Blackwood mentioned, people who had discovered the treasure over the past 20 years and paid the ultimate price for their greed. "What happens if I just leave?" Morrison asked, though part of him already knew the answer. "Walk away and never come back?" Blackwood's expression grew even more pained. "The curse would remain, and the guardians would continue to seek new victims. The gold calls to people, Morrison. It sends out a psychic summons that draws the greedy and the desperate from hundreds of miles away. Even if you resist its call, someone else will eventually come. Another treasure hunter, another outlaw seeking a place to hide, another dreamer who believes that wealth can solve all problems. And the cycle will begin again." Morrison could feel the truth of Blackwood's words. Even now, standing in the presence of hundreds of tortured souls and surrounded by evidence of the supernatural forces at work, part of him was calculating how much of the gold he could carry on horseback. The treasure was exerting a subtle influence on his mind, whispering promises of wealth and power that seemed to bypass his conscious thoughts and appeal directly to his deepest desires. "There has to be a way to break the curse," Morrison said, though he wasn't sure if he was asking the question or making a statement. "There is," Blackwood replied, and for the first time his ghostly voice carried a note of hope. "But It requires someone with the strength to resist the gold's call completely, someone who can walk away from infinite wealth and then take steps to ensure that no one else will ever be tempted by it. The curse can only be broken by someone who has the power to claim the treasure but chooses not to, and then seals this place forever so that the gold can never again lure victims to their doom. The spirits around Morrison began to step back, giving him room to move toward the tunnel entrance. He could see desperate hope in their ghostly faces, the same expression he had seen on the faces of men facing the gallows who still believed in the possibility of a last-minute reprieve. These souls had been trapped for 2 decades, conscious prisoners of their own greed and the supernatural forces that had exploited their weaknesses. Morrison represented their only chance for freedom, but that freedom could only come if he proved stronger than they had been. Morrison was a bounty hunter, a man who had built his reputation on being practical above all else. He understood risk and reward better than most people, and he knew when the odds were stacked against him. Everything about this situation screamed danger. The supernatural elements, the cursed gold, the testimony of hundreds of victims who had made the same mistake he was contemplating. Logic and experience both told him to walk away, to leave this place, and never look back. But Morrison was also a man who had spent his entire adult life pursuing money. The gold represented everything he had ever wanted: security, comfort, respect, the ability to live like a gentleman instead of a killer for hire. Even knowing the risks, even surrounded by evidence of what happened to people who gave in to temptation, he found it almost impossible to turn his back on such wealth. The internal struggle lasted several minutes, with Morrison standing frozen between the tunnel entrance and the pile of cursed gold. He could feel the supernatural forces at work trying to influence his decision, but he could also feel his own greed and ambition pulling him toward the treasure. This was the test that Blackwood had described, the moment when he would prove whether he was strong enough to break the curse or weak enough to join the ranks of the damned. Finally, Morrison made his choice. He turned his back on the gold and began walking toward the tunnel entrance, each step requiring tremendous effort as the supernatural forces tried to prevent his departure. Behind him, he could hear the spirits beginning to weep with relief, their ghostly voices raised in what sounded almost like a hymn of gratitude. But as Morrison reached the base of the stone steps leading back to the surface, he heard a sound that made his blood run cold. The unmistakable report of a rifle being fired somewhere above him. The shot echoed down the tunnel, followed by the sound of boots on wooden floors and a voice Morrison recognized calling his name. Dutch McKinnon had found him. Morrison climbed the stone steps as quickly as possible, emerging from the trapdoor into the church above. Through the stained glass windows, he could see the shadow of a man moving among the pews, and he knew that his pursuit of the outlaw had finally come to an end. But the circumstances were not what he had expected when he began tracking McKinnon 6 weeks ago. The bounty hunter drew his Colt and moved carefully through the church, using the pews for cover as he tried to locate McKinnon's position. The outlaw was somewhere in the building, but Morrison couldn't pinpoint his exact location from the sounds he was hearing. McKinnon was known for his cunning as well as his cruelty, and Morrison suspected the man was trying to set up an ambush. "Well, well, Jake Morrison," McKinnon's voice called out from somewhere near the front of the church. The famous bounty hunter come calling just like I knew he would. I've been watching you for the past hour, Morrison, sitting up in that bell tower with a clear view of the whole town. Saw you exploring building after building, getting more and more excited about what you were finding. Finally worked up the courage to visit the church basement, did you? Morrison could hear the amusement in McKinnon's voice, but there was something else there, too. An edge of excitement that suggested the outlaw had discovered something that pleased him greatly. Morrison suspected that McKinnon had been in Goldenvale for some time, perhaps days or even weeks, learning the town's secrets and waiting for someone else to do the dangerous work of investigating the supernatural phenomena. Funny thing about this place, McKinnon continued, his voice seeming to come from multiple directions as it echoed off the church walls. All those stories about ghosts and curses and people disappearing. I figured it was just tall tales told to keep folks away from something valuable. And I was right, wasn't I, Morrison? Found something mighty interesting down in that basement, didn't you? Morrison remained silent, trying to pinpoint McKinnon's location while staying under cover. The outlaw was somewhere near the altar, but the exact position was unclear. Morrison had dealt with McKinnon's type before, intelligent criminals who preferred to let others take the risks while they reaped the rewards. McKinnon had probably been watching the town for weeks, waiting for someone with the skills and determination to uncover its secrets. I know you're down there, Morrison. Saw you come up looking all spooked and thoughtful. What did you find in the basement that's got you so rattled? Gold? Has to be gold, or you wouldn't look so torn up about leaving it behind. McKinnon's guess was accurate enough to make Morrison's skin crawl. The outlaw had been watching him closely enough to read his internal struggle, which meant McKinnon had been in position to observe Morrison's entire exploration of the underground chamber. If the outlaw had seen the gold, the cursed treasure would already be working on his mind, making him increasingly desperate to claim it for himself. Morrison decided to take a calculated risk. It's cursed gold, McKinnon. Everyone who touches it dies. That's what happened to the townspeople 20 years ago, and that's what will happen to you if you go down there. McKinnon's laughter echoed through the church, but there was a manic edge to it that suggested the gold's supernatural influence was already affecting his judgment. Cursed gold? Come now, Morrison. I thought you were smarter than that. Gold is gold, no matter what superstitious nonsense people attach to it. The only curse on that treasure is the one that keeps weak-minded fools from claiming it. Morrison could hear McKinnon moving, and he realized the outlaw was working his way toward the trap door behind the altar. Once McKinnon saw the gold for himself, the supernatural forces would have another victim, and Morrison would lose his only chance to break the curse and free the trapped spirits. The bounty hunter made a decision that went against every professional instinct he possessed. Instead of trying to kill McKinnon, he was going to try to save him. "Listen to me, McKinnon," Morrison called out, rising from behind his cover with his hands visible, but his gun still ready. "I've seen what's down there. It's more gold than you can imagine, but it's protected by forces that will kill you if you try to take it. The smart play is to walk away." McKinnon appeared from behind the altar, his rifle trained on Morrison's chest. The outlaw was a lean man with cold eyes and the kind of smile that made decent people cross to the other side of the street. His clothes were travel-stained and his face bore the stubble of several days without shaving, but his hands were steady and his aim was true. "Forces that will kill me?" McKinnon repeated, his voice dripping with mockery. "What kind of forces, Morrison? Ghosts? Demons? Ancient Indian curses? I've spent my whole life taking what I want from people who try to scare me with stories about consequences and divine justice. The only force that matters in this world is the one that comes out of the barrel of a gun." To prove his point, McKinnon fired a shot that passed close enough to Morrison's ear to singe the hair. The bounty hunter dove for cover behind a pew, but McKinnon's next shot splintered the wood just inches from his head. The outlaw was an excellent marksman, and Morrison realized that McKinnon was toying with him, demonstrating his superior position rather than trying to kill him immediately. "Here's how this is going to work, Morrison," McKinnon called out. "You're going to go back down into that basement and load up as much gold as you can carry. Then you're going to bring it up here and load it on my horse. After that, I'll kill you quickly instead of slowly, which is more mercy than you deserve for making me chase you halfway across Nevada." Morrison knew there was no point in trying to reason with McKinnon. The outlaw had already made his decision, and the supernatural forces protecting the gold were probably already working on his mind, amplifying his natural greed and making it impossible for him to consider any option other than claiming the treasure. Morrison's only choice was to either fight McKinnon here in the church or find a way to escape and prevent the outlaw from descending into the chamber below. But before Morrison could formulate a plan, something extraordinary happened. The spirits of Goldenvale began to materialize in the church, becoming visible even in the afternoon sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows. McKinnon's confident expression transformed into one of terror as he found himself surrounded by the ghosts of 300 dead townspeople, their translucent forms filling every pew and lining every aisle. "What in the hell?" McKinnon began, but his words were cut off as the spirits began to speak in unison, their voices creating a chorus that seemed to come from the very air itself. "The gold calls to you," they said, their words carrying an hypnotic power that Morrison could feel even from his hiding place behind the pew. "The treasure awaits below. Come and claim your reward. Wealth beyond imagining lies just beneath your feet." Morrison realized what was happening. The curse wasn't just binding the spirits to protect the gold. It was using them to lure new victims to the treasure. McKinnon's greed was being amplified by supernatural forces, making it impossible for him to resist the call of the cursed metal. The outlaw's rifle began to lower as he stared with fascination at the ghostly figures surrounding him, his expression changing from fear to wonder to naked avarice. "Gold," McKinnon whispered, his voice filled with the same desperate hunger Morrison had heard in the voices of dying men calling for water. "You're showing me gold. There's gold down there, isn't there? More gold than I've ever dreamed of." The spirits nodded in unison, their ghostly faces now wearing expressions of supernatural cunning rather than the desperate sadness Morrison had seen in the underground chamber. These weren't the same entities he had spoken with below. These were manifestations created by the guardians Blackwood had mentioned, supernatural beings using the forms of the dead to manipulate the living. McKinnon began walking toward the trapdoor like a man in a trance, his rifle forgotten at his side. Morrison could have shot the outlaw in the back, completing the bounty that had brought him to Goldenvale in the first place. But Morrison had seen what lay beneath the church, had spoken with the real spirits of the townspeople, and knew that adding McKinnon's soul to the collection of the damned would only make the curse stronger. Instead, Morrison made a different choice. He followed McKinnon to the trapdoor, staying far enough back to avoid being caught in whatever supernatural influence was controlling the outlaw's actions. If McKinnon was determined to descend into the chamber, Morrison would be there to witness what happened and hopefully find a way to prevent the curse from claiming another victim. McKinnon descended the stone steps without hesitation, his movements mechanical and purposeful, as if he were being guided by an external will. Morrison followed at a safe distance, his torch providing light that revealed the true nature of the symbols carved into the tunnel walls. What had appeared to be random markings during his first descent now seemed to form patterns that hurt his eyes to look at directly, geometric shapes that suggested intelligence far older and more alien than anything human civilization had produced. When they reached the underground chamber, McKinnon stopped abruptly at the sight of the glowing gold bars stacked in the center of the space. His trance-like state broke, replaced by an expression of wonder and greed that was entirely his own. The supernatural influence had brought him to the treasure, but his reaction to it was genuine human avarice amplified to an almost inhuman degree. "Sweet Mother of God," McKinnon breathed, his voice filled with religious awe despite his blasphemous lifestyle. "Look at all that gold. There's enough here to buy half of California, enough to make me the richest man west of the Mississippi." Morrison watched from the tunnel entrance as McKinnon approached the treasure, drawn by the same irresistible force that had claimed all the previous victims. The outlaw reached out toward the nearest gold bar, his fingers trembling with anticipation as they drew closer to the cursed metal. "Don't touch it," Morrison called out, though he knew his warning would be ignored. "The moment you make contact with that gold, you'll be trapped here forever." McKinnon glanced back at Morrison with a smile that was equal parts triumph and madness. "Trapped? With more wealth than I can spend in 10 lifetimes? I'll take that kind of trap, Morrison. I'll take it gladly." McKinnon's fingers closed around one of the gold bars, and the transformation was immediate and horrible. The outlaw's scream of agony echoed through the chamber as the cursed metal burned into his flesh. But he couldn't let go. His hand seemed to be fused to the gold bar, and Morrison could see smoke rising from the point of contact. But even as McKinnon writhed in supernatural agony, his expression remained one of ecstatic greed. The pain was terrible, but the gold was fulfilling its promise of wealth even as it claimed his soul. Morrison could see the conflict playing out on the outlaw's face, the human part of him trying to escape, the cursed part of him reveling in finally possessing the treasure he had sought. The real spirits of Goldenvale began to materialize around McKinnon, their faces no longer showing the false welcome they had displayed in the church above. Now they wore expressions of profound sadness and regret, understanding that they had been forced once again to serve as unwilling instruments of the curse. Morrison could see Cornelius Blackwood among them, the gentleman ghost shaking his head in despair as another soul was added to their cursed ranks. McKinnon's screams gradually subsided as his body adapted to its new supernatural state. His flesh took on the translucent quality Morrison had observed in the other spirits, and his eyes began to glow with the same unnatural light as the gold bars. Within minutes, Dutch McKinnon, the living outlaw, had been transformed into Dutch McKinnon, the cursed guardian, bound to the treasure for eternity. "Welcome to our company," Blackwood's spirit said to the newest member of their damned fellowship. "You now understand the true price of the treasure you sought to claim. You have become its guardian, compelled to protect it from all who would take it, forced to serve the ancient powers that created this curse." McKinnon's ghostly form looked around the chamber with dawning horror as he realized what had happened to him. His greed had been satisfied. He now possessed more gold than he could have spent in 100 lifetimes. But he could never leave this place, never enjoy his wealth, never do anything but stand guard over the treasure that had claimed his soul. Morrison realized that this was his moment of greatest danger. The curse had claimed a new victim, and the spirits were now compelled to prevent him from leaving the chamber alive. He could see them beginning to move toward him, their ghostly forms radiating the cold that could freeze a man's blood in his veins. Among them, McKinnon's newly formed spirit was already raising spectral hands that glowed with supernatural fire. But instead of trying to fight his way out, Morrison did something that surprised everyone present, including himself. He walked directly to the pile of gold bars and placed his hand on the nearest one, fully expecting to suffer the same fate as McKinnon and all the others who had touched the cursed treasure. Nothing happened. The gold bar remained cool beneath Morrison's palm, showing none of the supernatural heat that had burned McKinnon's flesh. The expected fusion of metal and skin didn't occur, and Morrison felt no compulsion to remain in the chamber or serve as guardian of the treasure. He was touching the cursed gold with no apparent effect, something that Blackwood's expression suggested was impossible. "You resist the curse," Blackwood's spirit said, his voice filled with amazement. "In 20 years, you are the first person to touch the gold without being claimed by it. How is this possible?" Morrison wasn't entirely sure himself, but he suspected it had something to do with his decision to walk away from the treasure during his first visit to the chamber. He had been tempted by the gold, had felt its supernatural pull, but had ultimately chosen to leave it behind. Perhaps that act of resistance had provided some kind of protection against the curse's power. "I don't want it," Morrison said simply, and realized as he spoke the words that they were absolutely true. "I've seen what it costs, and I don't want any part of it. Some prices are too high to pay, no matter how great the reward." The spirits around him began to weep with relief, their ghostly tears falling like rain in the underground chamber. For the first time in 20 years, someone had touched their cursed treasure and chosen to reject it, breaking the supernatural bonds that held them prisoner in this underground hell. "You can free us," Blackwood said, his voice trembling with hope. "The curse can only be broken by someone who has the power to claim the treasure but chooses not to take it. You must seal this chamber forever, bury the gold so deep that no one will ever be tempted by it again." Morrison nodded, understanding what needed to be done. He had noticed mining equipment scattered throughout the chamber during his explorations, including charges of dynamite that the original miners had used to blast their way through solid rock. If he could bring down the ceiling of the chamber, the gold would be buried beneath tons of stone, ending its ability to lure victims to their doom. Working quickly, Morrison gathered the explosives and began placing charges at strategic points around the chamber. The spirits watched in fascination as he worked, their ghostly forms becoming more solid and lifelike as the possibility of freedom grew closer. Even McKinnon's newly cursed soul seemed to be recovering some measure of humanity as the prospect of release from eternal servitude became real. When the charges were set, Morrison retreated to the tunnel entrance and prepared the detonator. But before he could trigger the explosion, Blackwood's spirit approached him one final time. What you are doing will free our souls, but it will also destroy the greatest treasure ever found in the American West. Are you certain you want to give up so much wealth for the sake of strangers you never knew in life? Morrison looked around the chamber one more time, taking in the sight of the glowing gold bars and the hundreds of spirits who had paid the ultimate price for their greed. He thought about what the treasure could have bought him: security, comfort, respect, an end to his dangerous career as a bounty hunter. Then he thought about the cost: his soul, his freedom, and an eternity spent as a prisoner guarding wealth he could never enjoy. "I'm certain," Morrison said, and triggered the detonator. The explosion shook the entire town of Goldenvale, bringing down not just the underground chamber, but several of the buildings above as well. The church collapsed completely, its bell tower toppling into the desert sand with a crash that could be heard for miles. The sound of falling stone and timber continued for several minutes as the blast created a chain reaction that sealed the cursed treasure beneath tons of debris. When the dust finally settled, Morrison found himself standing in the ruins of what had once been Goldenvale's church. The trapdoor that had led to the chamber below was buried beneath massive stones, and the entire underground complex had been compressed into rubble that would take an army of miners years to clear. But more importantly, the oppressive atmosphere that had hung over Goldenvale was gone. The supernatural presence that had made the town feel like a graveyard had vanished, replaced by the clean, dry air of the Nevada desert. Morrison could feel the difference immediately. The weight that had pressed down on his shoulders since entering the town had lifted, and the unnatural silence had been replaced by the normal sounds of wind and settling timber. As Morrison picked his way through the debris toward where he had left Thunder, he became aware that he was not alone. The spirits of Goldenvale were visible one final time, but they were no longer the tortured, translucent figures he had seen in the underground chamber. They appeared solid and lifelike, their faces peaceful and their eyes clear of the supernatural compulsion that had bound them for 20 years. Cornelius Blackwood stepped forward from the group, and for the first time since Morrison had met him, the gentleman ghost was smiling with genuine joy rather than bitter regret. "You have freed us," Blackwood said, his voice carrying the warmth of a man who had finally found redemption after decades of guilt and shame. "Our souls are no longer bound to the cursed treasure, no longer compelled to serve as its guardians. We can finally find the peace that was denied to us for so long." Morrison nodded, feeling a satisfaction that was deeper and more fulfilling than any bounty reward he had ever collected. "What will happen to you now?" "We will move on to whatever comes after this life," Blackwood replied. "Some of us to heaven, some to hell, some perhaps to nothing at all. But we will go freely as ourselves rather than as slaves to ancient powers. That is a gift beyond price, Morrison, and we are eternally grateful for your sacrifice." One by one, the spirits of Goldenvale began to fade, their forms becoming less solid as they prepared for their journey to whatever lay beyond death. Some waved farewell to Morrison, Others simply smiled their gratitude, and a few, including several children, blew him kisses before vanishing into the desert air. Cornelius Blackwood was the last to go, and he had a final message for the bounty hunter who had saved them all. "You gave up more wealth than most men see in their lifetimes," Blackwood said, his form already beginning to fade around the edges. "But you gained something far more valuable. You kept your soul and your freedom. Remember that lesson, Morrison. Some treasures are worth more when left unclaimed." With those words, Blackwood's spirit faded away, leaving Morrison alone in the ruins of Goldenvale. The town was now truly a ghost town, empty not because of supernatural forces, but because its time had simply passed. In a few years, the desert would reclaim the remaining buildings, and Goldenvale would become just another forgotten dot on old maps that cartographers no longer bothered to update. Morrison found Thunder exactly where he had left him, but the stallion's nervous energy was completely gone. The horse nickered softly as his rider approached, and Morrison could swear he saw relief in the animal's intelligent eyes. Whatever supernatural influence had been affecting the town had been strong enough to disturb even the horses, but now Thunder seemed eager to continue their journey across the desert. As Morrison mounted up and prepared to leave Goldenvale forever, he took one last look at the ruins of what had been the most prosperous mining town in Nevada. The gold that had made the community wealthy was now buried deeper than it had been before human hands first touched it, sealed away where it could never again tempt the greedy or trap the unwary. The bounty hunter turned Thunder toward the setting sun and rode away from Goldenvale without looking back. Behind him, the ruined town settled into its final rest, its secrets buried forever beneath the desert sands. The only sound was the wind whistling through broken timber and the steady rhythm of hooves carrying Jake Morrison toward whatever adventure awaited him next. But Morrison was no longer the same man who had arrived in Goldenvale 3 days earlier. He had faced temptation greater than any he had ever known and found the strength to walk away from it. He had learned that some prices were too high to pay, no matter how great the reward, and that wisdom was often more valuable than wealth. In the days and weeks that followed, Morrison would occasionally encounter other treasure hunters and prospectors heading toward the general area where Goldenvale had stood. He always tried to discourage them, though he never told them the whole truth about what lay buried beneath the desert. Some listened to his warnings and changed course. Others insisted on continuing their search for easy wealth. Those who ignored Morrison's advice never returned from their expeditions, though whether they died of thirst, were killed by hostile Indians, or simply got lost in the vast emptiness of the Nevada desert, no one could say. Morrison suspected that some supernatural influence might still be at work, preventing people from finding the ruins of Goldenvale and disturbing the cursed treasure buried beneath them. But that was fine with Morrison. He had seen enough of supernatural forces to last him several lifetimes, and he was content to let the dead rest in peace. He had his freedom, his soul, and the knowledge that he had done the right thing when it mattered most. In the business of bounty hunting, that was a treasure worth more than all the gold in the world. Years later, when Morrison finally retired from his dangerous profession and bought a small ranch in Colorado, he would sometimes tell the story of Goldenvale to trusted friends who gathered around his fireplace on winter evenings. But he always changed the details, making it sound like a tale told to him by someone else, and he never revealed the exact location where the cursed treasure lay buried. Some stories Morrison had learned were too dangerous to tell in their entirety. Some mysteries were safer remaining mysteries, and some treasures were worth more when left unfound, protected by the wisdom of those who knew their true cost. The ghost town of Goldenvale had taught Jake Morrison the most valuable lesson of his life, that the greatest treasure a man could possess was the strength to walk away from his deepest desires when the price of fulfilling them was too high to pay. It was a lesson that served him well in his retirement, helping him find contentment in simple pleasures rather than constantly seeking the next big score. And on quiet nights, when the wind was blowing just right across the Nevada desert, Morrison would swear he could still hear voices carried on the breeze. Not the desperate whispers of the cursed, but something else entirely, the peaceful sighs of souls finally at rest, thanking a bounty hunter who had chosen mercy over money and freedom over gold.